The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of evening that promised peace, with families gathering for dinner and children's laughter echoing from distant playgrounds. But for Emma, the calm was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. Emma, a woman in her early 30s, had always carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't the type to seek attention, nor did she let the opinions of others sway her. A single mother to a curious and spirited 8-year-old Lucas, she had learned to face life's challenges head-on. Tonight, though, she was running a bit behind schedule, having just finished a long shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She parked her modest sit-in in her driveway, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, a small reminder that even the most ordinary days held a touch of beauty. Emma was about to head inside when the distant sound of roaring engines caught her attention. It started as a faint rumble but quickly grew louder, breaking through the stillness like thunder on a clear night. The unmistakable sound of motorbikes filled the air, and soon, 3 riders appeared at the end of her street. Their bikes were sleek and loud, painted in sharp, intimidating colors that seemed to reflect the riders' bold attitudes. Emma didn't recognize them, but something about the way they maneuvered their bikes, zigzagging down the road, revving their engines unnecessarily, made her pause. They were clearly out to make an impression, but on whom and why here? The bikers slowed as they approached her house, their expressions hidden behind dark helmets. Emma couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. She stood her ground, watching as they pulled to a stop in front of her driveway. One of them, the leader by the looks of it, removed his helmet. His face was rugged, his jaw set with a cocky smirk that seemed to say he enjoyed being underestimated. "Hey there," he called out, his voice loud enough to make Lucas peek through the curtains. "Nice car you've got. Shame about the neighborhood." Emma's heart quickened, but she refused to show any fear. She had dealt with her fair share of difficult situations. This was just another one, she told herself. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The leader chuckled and dismounted his bike, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. His companions followed suit, flanking him like loyal soldiers. "You could say that," he replied, walking closer. "Just thought we'd introduce ourselves to the neighborhood. Friendly gesture, you know." His words dripped with sarcasm, and Emma could tell this was no casual visit. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. She glanced back at her house, where Lucas's small face was now pressed against the window. For his sake, she needed to stay composed. "Well, you've introduced yourselves," Emma said, holding her ground. "You can move along now." The bikers exchanged glances, clearly amused by her defiance. The leader smirked again and took a step closer, invading her space. "You've got some nerve," he said, his tone shifting to something more menacing. "Most people would have been a little more cooperative by now." Emma's heart pounded, but she didn't back away. She met his gaze with a steely determination that caught him off guard. The other bikers seemed to sense the tension and started to circle her car, their movements slow and deliberate, as if daring her to react. For a moment, the street felt unnaturally quiet. The distant hum of crickets was drowned out by the oppressive weight of the confrontation. Emma knew she was outnumbered, but something inside her refused to let these men see her as weak. Then, as the leader opened his mouth to speak again, something unexpected happened. Emma took a step forward, her posture unyielding, and said in a voice that was both calm and commanding, "You've made your point. Now, I suggest you leave before things get complicated." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, the bikers hesitated. The leader tilted his head, studying her with newfound curiosity, as if trying to figure out what gave her the audacity to stand up to them. But Emma wasn't done. She reached into her pocket, and what she did next would leave them utterly speechless. Emma's hand slipped into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard surface of her phone. The bikers didn't know what she was reaching for, but their reactions told her they were second-guessing their approach. The leader squinted, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. "You really think this is smart?" Emma asked, her voice steady. "In a neighborhood like this, cameras everywhere. Witnesses. Not to mention, I'm not exactly the type to roll over. The bikers exchanged quick glances, their confidence shaken but not entirely gone. The leader chuckled, though the sound was more forced this time. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. But guts don't always keep you safe. Emma didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her tone dropping to a firm whisper, just loud enough for them to hear. Neither does making bad decisions. The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl that deepened the lines on his face. For a split second, the standoff hung in the air like a loaded question. Then, without a word, the leader took a step back, motioning to his crew. "Let's go," he muttered, though the edge in his voice hinted that this wasn't over. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life once more. Emma watched them as they sped down the street, their presence leaving behind an unsettling silence. She didn't move until the sound of the bikes had completely faded. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled her phone from her pocket. She hadn't called anyone, but she wanted to be ready. Inside the house, Lucas darted away from the window, scrambling to the door just as Emma stepped inside. "Mom," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of worry and excitement. "Who were those guys? What did they want?" Emma knelt down, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "Just some people who made a wrong turn, sweetie," she said, her voice soft but reassuring. "They're gone now, nothing to worry about." Lucas frowned, his big brown eyes searching hers for the truth. "They looked scary," he said quietly. Emma pulled him into a hug, holding him close for a moment. "Scary doesn't mean unstoppable," she whispered, more to herself than to him. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Emma sat in the dimly lit living room, replaying the encounter in her mind. Who were those bikers? Why had they chosen her street, her house? And most importantly, would they come back? She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random encounter. Something about the leader's demeanor, the way he studied her, the way he hesitated, felt deliberate. Emma had always been good at reading people, a skill honed from years of dealing with patients in high-stress situations. She knew when someone was bluffing and when someone meant business. And tonight, she couldn't tell which category these men fell into. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to a time when she had been forced to confront danger head-on. It wasn't something she liked to think about, but the memory surfaced now, unbidden. Years ago, before Lucas was born, Emma had found herself in a similarly tense situation. She had been younger then, less sure of herself, but she had learned a valuable lesson. Fear could either paralyze you or push you to act. Emma wasn't the type to be paralyzed. The next morning, she woke early, her mind already working on a plan. She didn't want to alarm Lucas, but she also couldn't ignore the possibility that the bikers might return. She made a mental note to check her home security cameras later and review the footage. At breakfast, Lucas seemed to have forgotten about the incident, chattering happily about his upcoming science project. Emma listened with a smile, grateful for the distraction, but her focus never strayed far from the nagging unease in the back of her mind. Later that day, as she walked to her car, she noticed something that made her pause. A faint streak of dirt on the side of her driveway, as if someone had stepped there recently. It wasn't unusual, but after last night, every small detail felt significant. She glanced around the neighborhood, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, quiet, peaceful, just as it always was, but Emma knew better than to let her guard down. As she drove to work, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of paranoia. Were the bikers following her? Watching her? She checked her rearview mirror more often than usual, but there were no signs of them. At the hospital, Emma tried to focus on her patients, throwing herself into the routine of her job. It was a welcome distraction, but the sense of unease lingered. During her lunch break, she pulled out her phone and did a quick search for recent incidents involving biker gangs in the area. What she found only added to her anxiety. A string of reports about a group of bikers harassing small businesses and neighborhoods had been circulating online. The descriptions matched the men who had shown up at her house. 3 riders, led by a man with a sharp, commanding presence. Emma frowned, her grip tightening on her phone. If these men were part of a larger pattern, then their visit to her house wasn't random. It was targeted. But why? What did they want from her? That evening, as she drove home, Emma decided it was time to take action. She couldn't let the fear of the unknown control her. She needed answers. When she pulled into her driveway, she noticed her neighbor, Mr. Carson, tending to his garden. He was an older man, retired, and known for keeping a watchful eye on the neighborhood. If anyone had noticed something unusual, it would be him. "Evening, Emma," he greeted, tipping his hat as she walked over. "Hi, Mr. Carson," she said, forcing a smile. "I wanted to ask if you noticed anything strange last night. A few guys on motorbikes stopped by, and it seemed odd." Mr. Carson straightened, his expression turning serious. "Motorbikes, you say? I did hear some noise around that time. Didn't think much of it, though. Did they bother you?" Emma hesitated, debating how much to share. "Not really, but they seemed a little off. Just wanted to make sure they weren't causing trouble for anyone else." Mr. Carson frowned, stroking his chin. "Now that you mention it, I did see some lights moving around down the street late at night. Thought it was just kids messing around, but maybe not." Emma thanked him and headed inside, her mind racing. If the bikers had been scoping out the neighborhood, they might have a bigger plan in mind. She needed to be ready for whatever came next. After Lucas was asleep, Emma sat in front of her laptop, pulling up the security footage from the previous night. As she scrubbed through the timeline, she froze. There in the grainy black and white video was a figure moving near her car hours after the bikers had left. The person was wearing a hoodie, their face obscured, but their movements were deliberate. They crouched by her car for a moment before disappearing into the shadows. Emma's heart pounded. This wasn't over. Whatever the bikers wanted, they were determined to get it. She closed the laptop, her jaw set with determination. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were wrong. Emma wasn't just a nurse, or a single mom, or a woman living alone. She was someone who knew how to stand her ground. And when the bikers came back, and she knew they would, she'd be ready. The following night was quieter than usual. Emma tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, that the tension in the air was nothing more than the echoes of her unease. But her instincts told her otherwise. Something had shifted, a subtle change in the energy around her house. After putting Lucas to bed, Emma double-checked all the locks and pulled the curtains tightly shut. She knew she couldn't live in fear, but ignoring the possibility of danger wasn't an option either. As she paced through the dimly lit living room, her thoughts churned. She needed more information. She needed to understand why those bikers had singled her out. The faint sound of a car passing outside drew her attention to the window. She peeked through the edge of the curtain, her heart sinking as she noticed a lone motorbike parked a few houses down. The rider wasn't visible, but the bike itself was unmistakable, a sharp, chrome machine with the same menacing aura as the ones from the night before. Emma stepped away from the window, her mind racing. Were they watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down? She considered calling the police, but hesitated. Without clear evidence of wrongdoing, what could she say? A part of her didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but another part, the part fueled by her growing unease, was ready to fight back. The hours dragged on, and the tension in the house grew heavier. Around midnight, Emma's phone buzzed, the sound startling in the stillness. She grabbed it quickly, glancing at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, "You're tougher than you look. Let's see how long that lasts." Asterisk. Her blood ran cold. The message was short, but the threat was clear. Emma stared at the words, her mind spinning. How had they gotten her number? Had they been following her for longer than she realized? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Panic wouldn't help. She needed a plan. The next morning, Emma made a call to an old friend, James, a retired police officer who had always been like an older brother to her. They hadn't spoken in a while, but she knew he would understand the seriousness of the situation. "Emma, you did the right thing by calling me," James said after she explained everything. His voice was calm but firm, a steady anchor in the storm of her fear. "These guys sound like trouble, and it's not just about intimidation. They might be testing you, seeing how far they can push." "What should I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay alert, but don't engage directly," James advised. And if they come back, call the police immediately. I'll also see if I can pull some strings and find out if there's been any chatter about them in the area. Feeling slightly more reassured, Emma spent the day preparing. She visited the local hardware store and bought extra locks, motion sensor lights, and even a personal alarm. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of control in a situation that felt increasingly out of her hands. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma installed the lights around her property, their sharp beams cutting through the growing darkness. Lucas watched from the porch, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you scared, Mom?" he asked quietly. Emma paused, looking up at him. She forced a smile, though her heart ached at the worry in his young eyes. "No, sweetheart, I'm just being careful. Sometimes it's better to be prepared than surprised." Lucas nodded, but Emma could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. As the night deepened, Emma kept herself busy, trying to shake the unease that clung to her. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when the sound of distant engines broke the silence. Her chest tightened, and she froze, listening. The engines grew louder, their growls echoing down the street. Emma quickly dried her hands and grabbed her phone, her pulse racing. She turned off the kitchen light and moved to the living room, peeking through a small gap in the curtains. 3 motorbikes rolled into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness like sharp blades. They stopped in front of her house, the riders dismounting with practiced ease. Emma's breath caught as she recognized the leader, his sharp features illuminated briefly by the streetlight. This time, they didn't stay outside. They moved toward her driveway, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Emma's fingers hovered over her phone screen, ready to call the police. But before she could, the leader called out. "We know you're in there," he said, his voice steady but laced with a dangerous edge. "Why don't you come out and talk? No need to make this harder than it has to be." Emma's heart pounded, but she didn't move. She didn't trust their words, and stepping outside felt like walking into a trap. "Nothing to say," the leader continued, his tone mocking. "All right then, we'll wait." The riders leaned casually against their bikes, their presence a clear message. This wasn't a random visit, it was a statement. Emma stayed hidden, her mind racing. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The bikers didn't leave, but they didn't escalate the situation either. It was a game of patience, and Emma wasn't sure how long she could hold out. Then, without warning, the motion sensor lights around her house flicked on, flooding the yard with bright, unrelenting light. The bikers flinched, momentarily caught off guard. Emma seized the moment, dialing James's number. "They're here," she whispered as soon as he answered. "Outside my house." "Stay inside," James said firmly. "I'll call the police and head over myself. Don't open the door, no matter what." Emma nodded, her grip tightening on the phone. She glanced back out the window and saw the bikers regrouping, their postures tense under the harsh glare of the lights. The leader looked directly at the house, his expression hard. He said something to the others, and they nodded before mounting their bikes. The roar of their engines filled the air as they sped away, disappearing into the night once more. Emma exhaled shakily, relief mingling with the lingering fear. She knew this wasn't over. Whatever game the bikers were playing, they were far from finished. When James arrived, his face was grim. "They're testing you," he said after surveying the scene, "seeing how far they can push before you push back." But the lights were a good move. They don't like being exposed. Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "I won't let them intimidate me," she said, her voice steady. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Good. But be careful, Emma. People like this don't play by the rules. They'll try again. And next time, they might not stop at intimidation." As James left, Emma stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The tension hadn't lessened. It had only deepened. She didn't know why the bikers had chosen her or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting Lucas, her home, and the life she had built. And no matter what it took, she wasn't going to let them win. The following days passed in a haze of unease. Emma kept her routine as normal as possible for Lucas's sake, but the tension simmered just below the surface. Every sound outside, every passing vehicle, felt like a potential threat. She knew the bikers hadn't given up. They were waiting, watching, biding their time. Emma spent hours reviewing the security footage from her cameras. The figure in the hoodie that she'd spotted before had returned twice, lurking near the edge of her driveway in the dead of night. They never stayed long, but their presence left her unsettled. Whoever they were careful, deliberate, and clearly testing her boundaries. One afternoon, Emma decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. She drove to a local community center where she'd heard about a neighborhood safety program. The group was small but dedicated, a mix of concerned residents and off-duty officers working to keep the area safe. As Emma explained her situation, the group listened intently. One of the members, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara, leaned forward. "These bikers you're describing, they're known around here. They target people who they think won't fight back. But you've already shown them you're not an easy target. That's probably why they're escalating." "What should I do?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. "Stay vigilant," Clara said, "and don't let them scare you into isolation. Fear is their weapon, and they'll use it to control you if you let them." That evening, as Emma drove home, she noticed a motorcycle following her at a distance. Her heart pounded as she checked her rearview mirror, trying to keep her movements calm and steady. She turned down a side street, then another, testing to see if the rider was truly tailing her. When they mirrored her turns, her fears were confirmed. Instead of panicking, Emma drove toward the local police station, her pulse racing. The rider seemed to realize her plan, peeling off into the opposite direction before she reached the station's parking lot. Emma sat in her car for a moment, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. They were watching her, testing her resolve again. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Emma sat in the living room, her thoughts racing. The bikers had made their intentions clear, but she wasn't going to let them win. She reviewed the plan she'd been crafting in her mind for days. It was risky, but she needed to take control of the situation. As the clock neared midnight, the sound of engines shattered the stillness. Emma's heart leaped, and she quickly turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the security cameras illuminating the yard. She moved to the window and peered out cautiously. The bikers were back, and this time, they weren't alone. 5 motorcycles lined the street in front of her house, their riders dismounting with practiced ease. The leader was there again, his sharp features illuminated by the dim streetlights. He gestured to the others, and they began spreading out, their movements purposeful and threatening. Emma's pulse quickened as she watched them approach. She grabbed her phone, dialing James' number with shaking hands. "They're here," she whispered. 5 of them. "They're surrounding the house." "Stay inside," James said, his voice calm but urgent. "I'm on my way, and I'll alert the police. Keep the doors locked and don't engage with them." Emma hung up, her breathing shallow. She moved quickly, locking every window and door, double-checking her preparations. The motion sensor lights flicked on as one of the bikers stepped onto her driveway, casting their figure in sharp relief. The leader called out, his voice cutting through the night. "All right, Emma. We're tired of playing games. Come out, and we can settle this the easy way." Emma didn't respond. She stayed hidden, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The leader's tone grew sharper. "You're making this harder than it has to be. You think your little cameras and lights are going to stop us. We're not going anywhere until we get what we came for." Emma's mind raced. What did they want? Why were they so intent on targeting her? She couldn't understand their motives, but she knew one thing for certain: they weren't expecting her to fight back. The sound of glass shattering upstairs jolted her into action. Someone had broken a window, their footsteps echoing faintly as they entered the house. Emma's heart pounded as she moved toward the stairs, her instincts screaming at her to protect Lucas. She grabbed the personal alarm she bought and pressed the button, the shrill, piercing sound filling the air. Outside, the bikers flinched, startled by the sudden noise. The leader shouted orders, trying to regain control of the situation. Emma's phone buzzed, and she answered quickly. It was James. "The police are 2 minutes away," he said. "Stay where you are. Help is coming." But Emma couldn't wait. She crept up the stairs, her footsteps as quiet as possible. She could hear someone moving down the hallway, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. Her mind raced as she approached Lucas's room. She needed to keep him safe, to get him out of the house if it came to that. As she reached for the doorknob, the figure at the end of the hallway turned, their face obscured by a hood. Emma's breath caught as they began to move toward her, their steps deliberate and unhurried. She braced herself, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as the distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. The figure stopped abruptly, glancing over their shoulder at the sound. For the first time, they hesitated, their confidence faltering. Emma could feel the tension crackling in the air, the moment hanging precariously between action and retreat. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cry cutting through the night. The bikers outside began to scatter, their engines roaring to life as they sped away. The figure in the hallway turned and bolted, disappearing through the broken window they had entered moments before. Emma exhaled shakily, her body trembling as the sound of the sirens filled the street. She rushed into Lucas's room, finding him huddled under the covers, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "It's over. We're safe." But even as she said the words, Emma knew the truth. This wasn't over. The bikers had retreated for now, but they weren't finished. The battle was far from won, and the real fight was still to come. The air was heavy with the wail of sirens fading into the distance as the police wrapped up their inspection of Emma's house. Lucas had finally fallen asleep in her arms after hours of reassurance, but Emma remained wide awake, her mind racing. The broken window, the invasion of her home. It felt like a warning, a message that the bikers were willing to cross any boundary. Yet something about the night didn't sit right with her. The timing of their retreat, the hesitation of the figure in her hallway. It felt deliberate, like part of a larger game she couldn't yet see. James stayed until the early hours, his presence a comforting anchor amidst the chaos. He walked her through the police report, his brow furrowed with concern. "This wasn't just a random scare," he said quietly. "They were testing you again, seeing how far they could push. But it doesn't make sense. They didn't take anything, and they didn't stay to confront you. It's like they wanted to send a message but not finish what they started." Emma nodded, her exhaustion evident but her resolve unbroken. "I don't understand their endgame, James. Why me? What do they want?" James's face darkened as he considered her words. "That's what worries me. They're calculating, Emma. This wasn't impulsive. They're after something specific, and until we figure out what it is, you have to stay vigilant." By morning, Emma was running on little sleep, her nerves raw, but her determination stronger than ever. She decided to review her security footage again, this time focusing on the figure who had entered her home. As she replayed the clips, something caught her eye, a detail she hadn't noticed before. The intruder wore a distinctive patch on their jacket, an emblem of sorts. It wasn't just a random biker's design. It was a symbol she vaguely recognized but couldn't place. Her curiosity piqued. Emma decided to dig deeper. She spent hours researching local biker gangs and their symbols, combing through articles and community forums. Finally, she found it. The patch belonged to a group known as the Iron Vipers, a notorious gang with a reputation for extortion, intimidation, and smuggling. They weren't just local troublemakers. They were a dangerous network operating across state lines. Emma's stomach churned as the pieces started falling into place. The Iron Vipers didn't target people randomly. They chose their victims carefully, often those who posed a threat to their operations or had something they wanted. But why her? She wasn't involved in anything remotely connected to their world, or so she thought. That afternoon, as Emma drove Lucas to school, she noticed a black SUV trailing her. It wasn't subtle, and that was intentional. Whoever was inside wanted her to know she was being followed. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind racing. The Iron Vipers were upping the stakes, showing her that she was under their watchful eye even in broad daylight. After dropping Lucas off, Emma drove to a nearby cafe, parking her car in a spot where she had a clear view of the SUV. She decided to test them, walking into the cafe but watching from the corner of her eye. The SUV stayed parked, its windows tinted, offering no glimpse of the occupants inside. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she pulled it out, a chill ran down her spine. The text was from the same unknown number as before. *, "You're getting too curious, Emma. Time to back off." Asterisk. Her breath caught as she read the words. They knew she'd been researching them. The patch, the cameras, her every move. They were watching. Emma felt her pulse quicken, but instead of retreating, something inside her hardened. If they thought they could scare her into submission, they were wrong. She wasn't going to let them win. Emma decided to confront the SUV directly. Her steps were steady, though her heart raced as she approached. But before she could reach it, the vehicle's engine roared to life, and it sped off, leaving her standing in the parking lot with more questions than answers. She noted the license plate, but it was partially obscured, a calculated move by whoever was inside. Later that day, James called with an update. "I've been digging into the Iron Vipers," he said. "They're bad news, Emma. And I found something you need to hear. A few years ago, a woman named Sarah went through something eerily similar to what's happening to you. She stood up to them, called the police, and refused to back down. But one day, she disappeared. No trace, no leads. Her case is still open, but everyone knows the Vipers were behind it." Emma felt a chill run through her. "What are you saying, James? That they'll try to make me disappear too?" "I'm saying you need to be careful," James replied. "This isn't just about you anymore. They'll use anything they can to break you, your home, your son, your life. Whatever their endgame is, they'll stop at nothing to get it." Emma's resolve deepened. She refused to let fear dictate her actions, but she also knew she needed help. She reached out to Clara from the safety program, explaining everything she'd discovered. Clara listened carefully, her expression grim. "We've dealt with groups like the Vipers before, but this is personal for them. You've become a target, and they won't stop unless we make them." That night, as Emma prepared for bed, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. Asterisk last warning. "Meet us tomorrow at the old quarry, 8 p.m. Come alone or you'll regret it." Asterisk. Emma stared at the screen, her emotions a turbulent mix of fear and anger. The quarry was a desolate place, far from help and surrounded by dense woods. It was the perfect location for the Vipers to corner her, to try and silence her once and for all. But Emma wasn't about to walk into their trap blindly. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Emma began laying out her plan. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and she was determined to turn the tables. The Vipers thought they had her cornered, but they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The night at the quarry was cloaked in a deep silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Emma's car idled at the edge of the gravel pit, its headlights cutting through the darkness. She sat behind the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The text instructions had been clear: come alone. But Emma wasn't about to follow their rules. Hidden in her jacket was a small recording device, and she made sure James and Clara were nearby with backup. If the Iron Vipers wanted to play games, she'd be ready. The growl of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. One by one, the bikers emerged from the shadows, their headlights illuminating the eerie surroundings. The leader was the last to arrive, his confident swagger unchanged. He stepped off his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached Emma's car. Emma stepped out, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She met the leader's cold gaze, refusing to flinch. He smirked, clearly amused by her boldness. "You've got guts showing up here, Emma. Most people know better than to cross us." Emma's voice was steady as she replied, "You've gone out of your way to threaten me, break into my home, and follow my every move. I think it's time you tell me why." The leader chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Why? Because you've got something we want, something you don't even realize you're holding onto." Emma's confusion deepened, but she didn't show it. She needed him to keep talking. "And what's that?" she asked. "Your late husband's little secret," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "Did you think his death was an accident? He owed us, Emma. Big time. And now, his debt falls on you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She'd never suspected that David's accident might not have been an accident at all. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the truth. "You're lying," she said, though her voice wavered. The leader's smirk widened. "Am I? Go ahead, think back. You really believe David was just another businessman? He worked for us, Emma. He got in too deep, And when he tried to back out, he paid the price. Now it's your turn. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to stay calm. I don't know anything about David's dealings with you. Whatever you think I have, you're wrong. The leader stepped closer, his expression darkening. We're not wrong. He hid something valuable, something we want. And you're going to help us find it. Emma's mind spun as she tried to figure out what they were after. David had always been private about his work, but she'd never imagined it could be tied to something this dangerous. Even if I knew where it was, why would I give it to you? She asked, stalling for time. Because if you don't, the leader said, his voice low and threatening, you'll wish you had. Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The bikers turned in unison, their confidence faltering for the first time. From the shadows, James and Clara emerged with a small team of officers, their weapons drawn. The leader's smirk vanished as he realized the trap had been sprung. Emma stood her ground as chaos erupted around her. The bikers scattered, their engines roaring as they tried to flee. The officers gave chase, the quarry suddenly alive with movement and noise. The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between Emma and the approaching officers. You think this ends here? He snarled, his voice filled with venom. This is far from over. Emma didn't flinch. It ends when I say it does, she said, her voice steady. The leader lunged toward her, but before he could reach her, James tackled him to the ground. The recording device in Emma's pocket had captured every word, and the evidence would ensure the Iron Vipers faced justice. As the dust settled and the bikers were led away in handcuffs, Emma felt a surge of relief. The nightmare was finally over. But as she turned to thank James and Clara, she noticed something odd. In the commotion, one of the bikers had slipped away, vanishing into the darkness. Emma's stomach twisted with unease. The fight wasn't truly over, not yet. The Vipers would regroup, and there was still the mystery of what David had hidden. But as she looked around at the people who had stood by her side, she knew she wasn't alone in this battle. Later that night, as Emma tucked Lucas into bed, she found herself reflecting on the twists her life had taken. She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain, she wouldn't stop until the truth was uncovered. The Iron Vipers had underestimated her, and they were about to learn that she was stronger than they could have ever imagined. As she turned off the lights, a single thought lingered in her mind. The leader's parting words echoed like a warning. This wasn't over, but Emma was ready. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, no matter the cost.